ask you, do you believe this is the Word of God? Do you believe it's true? Do you believe it's historically accurate, reliable? Why?
Good question. Join Dr. Bo Kirkwood as he reviews the evidences from McDowell's book and anchors our faith in God's book. Now, Dr. Bo Kirkwood.
So tonight we're continuing our class on the evidences, especially the evidences of the Bible, how we got the Bible, and the reliability of the Bible. And so for our YouTube audiences and for everyone in the class, the next 3 lessons will primarily be dealing with how we got the New Testament, not how we got it, but about the historical reliability of the New Testament. Now, there's some overlap, and so there'll be some overlap and some redundancy here, and you'll see that because there's a little bit, they're kind of related, how we got the Bible and whether or not it's historically reliable or not. But we've established, I think, over the last several lessons, how the Bible came to us. So what's the purpose now? Well, it's one thing to have it, but now we need to know, is it historically reliable? Because if it's not historically reliable, that would give evidence that it may not be inspired. You know, if it was talking about things that were not historically accurate, were not reliable, that sort of thing, it would give evidence that maybe it wasn't inspired. And not only that, we're going to be looking at the evidence as to, okay, we know how we got it, but is there evidence as to what we have now? Was that what was written in the first century? You know, because there's people that make the argument, especially the Mormons, that say the Bible has been adulterated. It's not accurate. It's not what was really written back in the first century. And if you go to the Old Testament, a lot further back than that. So that's what these next lessons are going to be about. After we finish with the Old Testament and its historical reliability, we will be looking in depth at the after we finish the New Testament, that is, we'll be looking at the Old Testament. But it may sound like we're going about this backwards, but like I said, this is how McDowell does it in his book, the New Evidence book, which is the book we're using. That's the way he does it. He starts with the New Testament. And like I said, once you establish the reliability of the New Testament and you show that the New Testament writers quoted from the Old Testament very, very frequently, including Jesus Christ, then you've established the reliability of the Old Testament to a large extent, haven't you? But we'll be looking at the historical reliability of both of these books. And as I said also, we will be using also Lee Strobel's book, A Case for Christ, and that will encompass for the next 3 lessons about the first 6 chapters here. And there's some overlap between what he's written and what McDowell's written because the evidences are the same. You would expect some overlap there, but there's some things that he adds that are I think, of benefit. So let's look at how would you establish any document as far as its historical reliability. And McDowell says in his book that there's 3 basic principles of historiography. And one is the bibliographical test, which we'll be spending the first part of this lesson tonight talking about. Once again, is the book itself reliable? Is it the book that was written in the first century? Is there evidence that we have what the apostles and what the writers of the first century had written down? That's the bibliographical evidence. Then you have the internal evidence. Is the stuff in the book, internally in the book, does it fit? Does it fit historically? And then you have the external evidence. Well, what would that be? That would be things outside the Bible. Are there things outside the Bible that also show that the things that are in the Bible are historically accurate and show that we've got a valid book? So that's what the 3 evidences are. And this actually comes from C. Sanders in his Introduction to Research in English Literary History. Sanders wasn't looking at the Bible. He was looking at any document, any historical document, or any historical piece of literature, whether it be Shakespeare or the Homer's Iliad, that sort of thing. These are the same kind of tests that you would use. When you're reading Homer's Iliad, are you really reading what Homer wrote? That sort of thing. And is there continuity in between the various versions? So we're going to look at the bibliographical test of the reliability of the New Testament. So does anybody here think that we have the originals? I'm pretty sure you know that we don't have the originals. Is that a problem for you? Well, if it's a problem, yeah, and it's not a problem for me either. You wouldn't really expect to have the originals. So do you have the handwritten letter that let's say John wrote, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John? Do we have that? We do not. We don't have it. So we know that we don't have that. And since we don't have the original documents, then how reliable are the copies? We have copies of those documents in regard to the number of manuscripts and the time interval between the original and the extant. The word extant just means what we actually have now. That's what the word means. So how reliable is that? Would you think that the closer you have to the original, the more likely it would be that you have the real thing? So if you had a document that was 1,000 years removed, I'm talking about the copy. If you have a copy of the document that was 1,000 years removed from the original, and you don't have anything in between, that would be you'd be a little more skeptical of that document, would you not? At least I would be. But what you're going to find today is the copies that we have are all really, from a historical point of view, from a literature point of view, they're really pretty close. And they all agree with each other for the most part. So that's the sort of thing we'll be looking at. And you'll find, and we'll see this today, that the manuscripts of the New Testament, we have a whole lot more than any other book in history. And F.E. Peters says, on the basis of manuscript tradition alone, the works that made up the Christians' New Testament were the most frequently copied and widely circulated books of antiquity. There's nothing that comes close. Nothing that even approaches it as far as the sheer numbers and the volume that we have. And we'll be looking at that. So counting the Greek. Now the Greeks were the first copies that we had. In fact, a lot of the books were written in Greek. Probably written in Greek. Because that was the language of the day in Jerusalem, wasn't it? They had the Hebrew language, but they were also Greek. They used Greek to speak with. At least that was a common language. And so the copies that we have, a lot of them are Greek copies. And the New Testament Greek copies that are preserved today, there's some 5,656 either partial or complete manuscript portions from the 2nd through the 5th century. So when you count the 1st century, that's AD 0 to 100. So when you're talking about 2nd century, you're not talking about the year 250. You're talking about the year 150, 175. You understand that? That would be the 2nd century. Just like we're in the 21st century now, but we're not, it's 2016, right? So we see copies that started as early as the 2nd century. But most of them were later than that. But ranging through the 15th century, there was 5,656 copies. Now, there were other versions as well. There were other languages as well, Latin being one of them. And there are 2,000 Latin Vulgate, of which at least 9,300 early versions, making up 25,000 manuscript copies of portions of the New Testament in existence today. And it's actually much higher than that. So the Latin Vulgate is 2,000, and then there's other versions, 9,300. Bottom line is we have a lot of copies of the New Testament. A lot of copies. And no other, like we said, no other document in antiquity even comes close to this. Now, like we were talking about on how we got the Bible, does this prove the inspiration of the Bible? No, but it gives you pretty good evidence. And at least it gives you evidence that probably what Paul or what James or what Peter or what Mark or Luke wrote, we have. But as far as proving inspiration, it isn't proof of the inspiration. You understand that. But it certainly is part of the evidence. And the evidence keeps mounting and mounting and mounting till you have to make a decision on which one you believe. So, to give you, I mentioned Homer's Iliad earlier. Most people don't doubt that Homer wrote the Iliad. You know, we read that probably when you're in high school or college, you read a part of Homer's Iliad. And we don't doubt that we probably have Homer's Iliad or what Homer wrote. Well, how many copies do we have of Homer's Iliad? 643. And guess what the earliest dating of Homer's Iliad, those copies are? They're 13 centuries away from, they were written in the 13th century. In the original Homer's Iliad, Homer lived before Christ. So we're talking about minimum of 1,400 years from the time it was written until we have the copy. That's a lot of difference between what we have in the New Testament, isn't it? Where you have maybe 1 century between our earliest, maybe a century and a half, which may seem like a long time to us, but it's really not, compared to Homer's Iliad. And yet you don't get the same criticism of Homer's Iliad as you get the New Testament. Well, you can't believe that. That was written so long ago. There's been so many copies. You don't see that argument. You don't see that argument with Shakespeare. Do you think we have the actual written letters of Shakespeare as far as his plays are concerned? No, we have copies of those. So the importance and the number of manuscripts cannot really be overstated. There's a wealth of manuscripts and copies. That part cannot be overstated. So with the abundance of manuscripts, either partial or complete, it makes it possible to reconstruct the original with virtual complete accuracy. Now there's a little word thrown in there called virtual, and that means there are some discrepancies in the manuscripts, and we're going to spend some period of time on our third lesson talking about that, because there are people that have written, there are hundreds of thousands of discrepancies between the copies of the New Testament. Does that surprise you? So the inspiration of God doesn't mean, in the inerrancy of the New Testament, doesn't mean that every person that copied those copies was inspired. You understand? The copyists weren't inspired. They were copying what the inspired person wrote. But, for whatever reason, the hand of God wasn't over every one of those so that they did not make a mistake, be it in spelling, be it in punctuation, being in just an omission of some sort. And there are hundreds of thousands. I'll give you that right now. There are hundreds of thousands of mistakes within those copies. But we will look at those mistakes, and they're virtually all, 99% of them, are so minimal they make no difference whatsoever, and it's very understandable. But you would expect there to be mistakes. 25,000 copies, and they would be all exact. You would expect that. And that's why I like to say this is virtual, complete accuracy. And by the way, if you have your New Testament and you go in your New Testament and you see your footnotes, most of the places where there are substantial mistakes or omissions, you will see those in your New Testament. This passage is not included in all manuscripts. Do you see that in your Bibles? You see that. Well, that's where maybe and those are big mistakes there. Not mistakes, but those are big differences there. But your Bible will let you know about it. And they never change anything from a doctrinal standpoint. None of them do. There's nothing that is of any doctrinal support. So to the skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to be skeptical, of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no documents of ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. This comes from John Warwick. So once again, if you're skeptical of the New Testament, you need to be skeptical of all books of antiquity. The histories of the Roman Empire, the book of the Iliad, so on and so forth. You need to be very skeptical of those, because we have a lot more evidence that we have in the New Testament as original than we do those books. Now, the earliest extant manuscripts of the New Testament are of the 4th century, from 250 to 300 years later than the original. This is talking about the complete book. We have portions before then. We'll look at that in a minute. But if you want to look at a complete listing with all the books of the New Testament, the earliest we have was written the copy is about 250 years after the original was written. And like Sir Frederick G. Kenyon says here, this may sound like considerable interval, but it is nothing to that. Which parts most of the great classical authors for the earliest manuscripts. So even though we have a 250-year gap between the original and the first complete New Testament, that's really nothing compared to the other books of literature. And so this is from Dockery, Mathews, and Sloan, who we've looked at before. Elimination of scribal errors and intentional changes leave only a small percentage of the text about which any questions occur. And like I said, we're going to look at that in some detail in the third class. There are many more early manuscripts of the New Testament than there are any classical author, and the oldest extensive remains of it date only about 2 centuries after the original composition, W.F. Albright. And this is pretty much all agreed to by New Testament scholars. Some partial manuscripts of the New Testament are actually from the 2nd century A.D., and many within 4 centuries of the originals. So we're going to look at those examples here in just a second. So let's just compare this then between the time interval between the New Testament and ancient historical writings. Caesar's Gallic Wars, written about 58 50 BC. There's only 9 or 10 of those manuscripts around, and the oldest is some 900 years later than the originals. Long time. And there's not very many of them. And yet people consider this accurate data. The Roman history of Livy, written between 59 BC and 17 AD. There's only 35 extant manuscripts, and the most recent was from the 4th century, so over 400 years later. The history of Tacitus, AD 100. We've only got 4 of those that are extant, and those copies are from 9 to 11 centuries later, or written in the 9th through the 11th century. I just lumped these all together, including Homer, but the Greek classical authors, 1,000 years after the death of the author. The Latin authors, such as Virgil, 3 centuries after the original. Plato and his writings, Timaeus and so forth, written 400 BC. The earliest copies are 900 AD. What would that be, 1,300 years later? And again, when people read Plato, they say, we're reading Plato. They don't question that. We're reading Plato. And yet, the earliest copy is 1,300 years after the original, and just etc. We could go on and on. Point is, what we have is written much earlier than most of these, and as far as the number of copies, there's no comparison. We're talking about 25,000 plus. So let's look at some important New Testament manuscripts. And I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning here. John Ryland's manuscript, probably the oldest manuscript we have today, and it's only a very small portion. It's not very big, just a little piece of parchment. And it's dated around 130 AD, and it's from the Gospel of John, who wrote the epistle, or the Gospel, probably in 70, 80 AD. So this is not very far removed at all. And we have that. It's around. Then you have the Bodmer Papyrus, and it's most of John's Gospel, written also, or copied, once again copied, between 150 to 200 AD. Also in that same papyrus, that collection, is the Epistle of Jude and 2 epistles of Peter and the Gospel of Luke, all written out about 175 to 225 AD, or copied. So these copies were written, in this case, about 100 years, a little over 100 years from the time they were written. In our time frame, what would that be? It's 2016, so that would be like having a copy from 1916. Not really that long. Then you have the Chester Beatty Papyri, found in the Beatty Museum in Dublin. It's also owned by University of Michigan, written about 200 AD. Again, these are not the full books, but these are copies of some of the books. It contains major portions of the New Testament, written about 200 AD, very close to the original. And then these further out we get, the more complete we have now, and also a little bit further out as far as the time written. The Codex Vaticanus, where do you think that's at? At the Vatican. And it was copied at about 325 to 350, and it contains almost all of the Bible. And then Codex Sinaiticus, about 350 AD. It's in the British Museum. Contains almost all the New Testament and half of the Old Testament. And I'm just mentioning you these. These are the ones that have the popularity and the most talked about. The Codex Alexandrinus is also in the British Museum, written about 400 AD, contains the entire Bible. And then the Codex Epiphany in 400, found in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, right out of Dan Brown's book, the Bibliothèque Nationale. And it was 400, written about 400, and it's portions of the New Testament. Then we have the Codex Bezae, 450 plus, found in the Cambridge Library, contains the Gospels and all the Acts in Greek and in Latin. And you even have one, Washington Genesis, 450 AD, contains the 4 Gospels. These are, and this is in the Smithsonian. Good name for it there, see, it's in Washington. And then finally, I think this is flying, the Codex Claromanus, 500 AD, contains the epistles of Paul. Now those are copies of the original. Copies of copies, but copies that supposedly came from the original. Now we're going to have other evidences too that we have the real thing too, and we're going to look at the versions, various versions. So what would a version be? A version would be a translation of an earlier manuscript. This just adds to the evidence that what we have is the real deal, correct? So you have the old Syriac version. That's the 4th century AD. You have the Latin versions, the Old Latin, 4th through 13th, and then the Latin Vulgate between 360 and 384, translated by Jerome. And again, these are versions. These are not copies, these are versions. And then you have the Coptic. These are Egyptian versions, written 300 to 400 century AD. And there's a lot of other earlier versions, lots of others. There's the Armenian, there's the Gothic, there's the Georgian, the Ethiopian, the Nubian. So when you have these versions that are all saying the same thing, the very same thing as the copies, gives you more credence that the copies were real. Then you have something called lectionaries. Well, lectionaries, the best that I can explain it, would be someone's going to preach, and you're going to copy what that person preached. And that person preaching is going to be quoting from something they had in front of them, which you would assume would be the New Testament in this case. But you don't have what he's reading from, you have what he's quoting from. So these would be lectionaries. But if you copied correctly those lectionaries and they quote a passage, then it should line up with the copies that you have, correct? And they do, and we have tons of these. The readings of scriptures from the New Testament books at the time of a service of worship. And so this is from Metzger, who Metzger is one of the most famous biblical scholars that's ever lived, and he says there's 2,135. This was when he first categorized them. And there's been more categorization since then. It's now up to 2,396. These are lectionaries, once again, and quite frankly, it's probably higher than that now. So these also add to the fact that what you have is, again, the real deal. Just more evidence that what you have is the New Testament. So this idea that what we have has been adulterated is not the same thing. This adds evidence that that's not true. These all agree with each other. There's not discrepancies. So the lectionaries were valuable from a secondary standpoint. No, they're not copies, but they're somebody writing down what that person was preaching. Lectionaries. They contain all the New Testament except for the book of Revelation and part of the Acts. So we can reconstruct the entire Bible except for parts of Acts and the book of Revelation from lectionaries alone. So, and these primarily come from the time of the Byzantines. Lectionaries influence the understanding of specific passages. And then there's something called the patristic citations. The word patristic, idea of fatherly, okay? So these are called the early church fathers. This isn't my term for these individuals. This is McDowell's term and what's frequently used as quote unquote church fathers. I'm not a fan of that, but most of these people were elders in the churches. They were not the elder. You'll hear that sometime. This was the elder at Corinth. No, they were elders there. They hadn't established an elder at a place at that point, but they were elders there. So when you hear that they were bishops, that they were bishops, they were elders. But these were people that would be very early in the church. And they would be, again, teaching from the apostles in the letters that they had from the apostles. And by the way, I needed to bring up something because Norris Long mentioned this after the lesson that I didn't really make clear. What would they have had in the first century that we don't have now that would have helped them to discern what they had was real from the apostles and the teachings that they had? What do they have that we don't have now? Yeah, they had gifts. And those gifts, there was gifts of what? Knowledge. There was gifts of wisdom. So they had a way that we don't now. That's a matter of faith. I understand that. But what I'm trying to point out is they would have a way of knowing in that first century, in our early fathers, what was real and what wasn't, because some of those people had their hands laid on them by the apostles. Some of these early fathers, no doubt, had those gifts. Well, they're not there now. There's no apostles left to lay hands on us. We don't have those gifts. They would have had them in the first century. So when you see these patristic citations, I don't know who had those gifts in total. I can't say that for sure. But some of the people we're going to be citing here were contemporaries of John and Paul. Well, it would make sense to me, at least, that very possibly they had some of those gifts of knowledge and gifts of teachings that we read about in our New Testament. So that's what patristic citations are. These fathers, these elders, these bishops in the church, these leaders in the church, they are going to be quoting from these epistles once again. Kind of a lot like the lectionaries. There's a lot of similarity. But these go back a lot closer to the original than the lectionaries do. And there are overwhelming support to the existence of 27 authoritative books in the New Testament based upon the patristic citations alone. These quotations are so numerous and widespread that if the New Testament were not extant, the New Testament could be reproduced from the writings of the early fathers alone. If we didn't have those copies, if all we had was this, you could still have your full New Testament, just based upon the patristic citations alone. And the fact that they mesh with the copies that we have is more evidence that what we have is the real deal. I think this is all by the providence of God, by the way. God could have somehow preserved the original writings, don't you think, if he wanted to? Do you think of any wisdom why maybe that wouldn't be such a good idea? Yes, exactly. We would be worshiping those things. We would be worshiping those copies. We don't have them. And like I say, I mean, come on. They're supposedly pieces of the cross that the Catholic Church has that are treated like idols, basically. So I think it's not a bad thing. And think it comes from the providence of God. So you have Clement of Rome. There's two Clements now. We say Clement of Rome. When did he live? 95 AD. He would have been a contemporary of the apostles. Ignatius, 70 to 110, a bishop at Antioch, knew the apostles personally. And so there's citations from him. Polycarp, you've heard of Polycarp, also lived between 70 and 156, martyred at age 86, was supposed to be a disciple of the Apostle John. Makes sense to me. He may have had some of those spiritual gifts. Whether he did or not, we have citations from Polycarp that correspond to our New Testament that we have today. These are, I think, important points if you're trying to prove how reliable and how historically reliable your New Testament is. Clement of Alexandria. Now this goes further back now. He would not have been a contemporary of any of the apostles. They would have died by then. But he was very close. First, maybe at most, a second generation removed. Tertullian, same kind of thing. 160 to 220. He was a presbyter of the church of Carthage, and he quotes the New Testament more than 7,000 times. And this would have been in the 2nd and 3rd century, late 2nd, early 3rd century. Hippolytus, again, very close to the same time. Hippolytus had over 1,300 references to the New Testament. Justin Martyr, 130 AD, AD 130. Origen, 185 to 253 AD, over 6,000 works and 18,000 quotes. And then Cyprian, 258, again, bishop, I'd say one of the bishops at Carthage, 1,030 New Testament citations and 740 Old Testament citations. So, from Geisler and Nix, who we've quoted before in this class, there were some 32,000 citations of the New Testament prior to the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD. Now, I don't know why Josh McDowell brings that up in Geisler and Nix, but I tell you one of the reasons that's brought up is some people think that at the Council of Nicaea, that's where the New Testament was voted on, straight out of Dan Brown's book once again. And Dan Brown wasn't original with Dan Brown. He got this from other people. Nonsense. It's just not true. The Bible wasn't voted on at the Council of Nicaea. They dealt with some heretical works, but the canon had already been established, like we talked about. And like we say, there was 32,000 citations of the New Testament prior to the Council of Nicaea. And this list is not exhaustive. So Leo Jagany notes that the patristic quotations of the New Testament, He has found this, and it consists of 16 thick volumes to be found in the British Museum, and there's over 86,489 quotations. So you could easily see how the entire New Testament could be derived at by just looking at the patristic citations, correct? Any questions? That's the bibliographic evidence. Yes, sir.
It never really comes out and says it in the book, but I guess it's pointed towards that the reason we have so few early on and so much more as the years go on is the technology of what they're writing on.
Correct. Well, no, and I don't remember.
The only reason?
That is the reason. What they were writing on, exactly. They wrote on papyrus. The early books were written on papyrus. Almost like writing on tissue paper. I mean, not quite that bad, but can you imagine how long something you have written would last if you wrote it on, one of your handy wipes or something? It wouldn't last very long. And that's exactly why. Yeah, those would not have stayed around very long. Just like when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only reason the Dead Sea Scrolls are around is because it was a bit of accident, basically, where they were stored. They were stored in a cave. They were stored in a very dry environment. And those papyrus sheets lasted because they just happened to be luckily stored there. But the rest are not there, and that's why you don't have the manuscripts of these other people. It's the same reason.
The amount of work that goes into just one manuscript. Think about how much time it takes to copy and repeat words after words after words. You would think they would want to preserve that, but if that's all they had, that was the best thing they had at that point in time, then that makes more sense.
Exactly. And as far as the Jews and the Septuagint, they had scribes. What was a scribe's job? I mean, that's what they did. Scribes wrote things down, and that was their full-time job. Obviously, they didn't have the technology we have now. But even our books, these books don't last that long. You let a book like this sit on the shelf for a couple of hundred years, and it's going to be hard to read. I mean, I've got some old medical textbooks that go back to the 20th or early 20th century, which isn't all that long, and the pages are already falling apart. You got to be very careful with just the way you open them up and read them. And that's not papyrus, that's paper. So that's a good point. But yes, and again, that's true of of all those other books of literature, it was what they were written on. You wouldn't expect them to. You wouldn't expect them to. But God in His providence could have somehow saved the letters written by Paul to the original. He could have done that. God had the ability to do that, obviously. Whatever reason, chose not to. We don't have the original. I hope that's not an issue after looking at this. But again, if it is a problem, then you got a problem with all ancient antiquity. You have it with all. And it don't even have to be all that ancient. Go back a few hundred years, you have the same problem there. When they had better technology, and we still don't have those originals. Okay, so we're going to get in. We'll start this up again next week, but since we got about 5 minutes, we will look at internal evidence to test the reliability of the New Testament. Now, in this portion of your book on McDowell, he doesn't go into what those discrepancies are. He's giving you arguments why, when somebody brings up the discrepancies, how to deal with them. I'm going to bring up some of those discrepancies specifically in the third class. Okay, so we're going to look at some of those. But are there discrepancies within the copies? So if you got 26,000 or more copies, and how many lectionaries and quotes and all that, again, there's going to be some discrepancies because you got thousands and thousands of people that are copying these books. And you're going to expect some discrepancies. Some of them, the vast majority of them, are just totally unintentional. But your eyes could get weary after you're starting to write so many pages and you did this all day long and it's a very, very tedious thing. You could see where you might miss a letter or miss a comma or whatever. You would miss something like that. Your skeptics are going to jump on that. They're going to jump on it. They're going to say, whoa, it's inaccurate. Are they right? Yes, they're right. But the inaccuracies are so minuscule that they make absolutely no difference. But there's going to be. And so when you're looking at discrepancies, you got to look at how valid those arguments are. And there's some other discrepancies have to do historically. Are there historical accuracies there? And are there discrepancies between the history part? Well, this is the internal evidence that we're talking about here. And this is what John Warwick says, and it's in your book, Josh McDowell. But the benefit of doubt is to be given to the document itself first. There's a misspelling. There's a letter written. That makes it inaccurate. No, the benefit of the doubt should be given to the document itself first and not arrogated to the critic himself. But people have made a lot of money writing books about these discrepancies. And we'll be talking about that in our third class, as I mentioned. So when you look at this, one must listen to the claims of the document under analysis and not assume fraud or error unless the author disqualified himself by contradictions or known factual inaccuracies. Difficulties do not constitute an objection. We have difficulties interpreting some passages or knowing exactly what those passages say. They don't have to do with doctrinal things, but there's differences that we have sometimes. But a difficulty does not constitute an objection necessarily. And a lot of times difficulties that were brought up before that we may not have had an answer to, 40, 50, 60 years later, the answer is found, and that wasn't a discrepancy at all to begin with. Why? First of all, you must correctly understand the passage. Look at what the passage actually says, not what you think it says. Secondly, do we possess all available knowledge in that matter? And we must have it if we're going to look at a discrepancy. Also, no further light can possibly be thrown on it by advancing knowledge, technical research, archaeology, etc. Maybe a particular city is mentioned in the Old Testament, or in this case, we'll use the New Testament. A particular city, because this is what's happened, a city is mentioned that we can't find historically. Well, what could be the problem? Just hadn't found it yet. And that's exactly what's happened. Okay, just because we read that, and we'll talk about this later on. Some people doubted there's a city of Nazareth. Did you know that? Did you know that people said, no, there's no recollection. The city of Nazareth is not mentioned in the Old Testament. I can't find it anywhere. So therefore, that's an error. No, because now it's been discovered, okay? Now we know, a very small city, by the way, very, very small city, but it was a village. I wouldn't even call it a city. It was a small village. But that's the kind of things that you'll see when you have skeptics trying to shoot down the Bible, which they're constantly doing. It's just possible that further research is going to shed light on it that we don't have right now. Doesn't mean necessarily it's wrong. Now, if there's a complete contradiction, that's different. And this is what our author says, and we will end with this. Countless objections have been resolved over the last several centuries concerning these documentation discrepancies. Any further questions? All right, thank you for your attention, and we'll continue this subject next week.